She invited a wolf into her home. She gave him warmth and bread and the kind of quiet that heals things words cannot reach. She never asked for anything in return. But there are rules in the world of alphas and kings and claimed territories, ancient, unforgiving rules, and one of them is this: what a king touches, his enemies will use against him. Maren didn't know she was in danger. She didn't know that the man with the gold eyes who sat across her fire and smiled at her bread like it was the finest thing he'd ever tasted had brought a war to her doorstep simply by choosing her doorstep to return to. She was about to find out. Spring came to the ashwood border the way it always did, slowly, and then all at once. First, it was only the light that changed, arriving a few minutes earlier each morning, staying a few minutes longer each evening, shifting in quality from the flat white of deep winter to something softer and more golden that made the snow look less like a siege and more like something ready to let go. Then the sounds changed, the return of a single bird first, tentative and bewildered sounding, as if it couldn't quite believe its own optimism, and then more, and then the full chorus of it, mornings that rang with noise after months of silence. Then the smells came back, cold earth and pine resin, and the distant sweetness of moving water as the creek at the forest's edge began to wake from its freeze. Maren noticed all of it. She always noticed. It was one of the things she loved best about living so close to the wild, the way the seasons were not announcements, but conversations, long and layered and full of nuance. She noticed the spring, and she noticed something else alongside it, something interior, a warmth that did not come from the lengthening days but had been quietly present since a gray morning in late winter when a gold-eyed man had stood at her door and told her the truth. She and Kael had fallen into something that neither of them had a practiced name for, because neither of them had been here before. He came to the cottage every few days, sometimes in his wolf form, padding out of the tree line in the early evening, settling in his corner of the shed with the ease of long habit, and sometimes as himself, as the man, arriving at her door with the particular expression of someone who has decided to do something and hasn't entirely made peace with how much they want to do it. On those evenings, they sat at her small table and talked for hours. He told her, carefully at first and then with growing ease, about the Northmark, the 5 territories it encompassed, the pack structure, the politics that were always simmering just below the surface of order. She told him about her life before the cottage, the village she'd grown up in, the medic who'd taught her, the reasons she'd chosen solitude that she was only recently beginning to think were perhaps not the whole story of what she needed. He had learned that she took her tea very strong and that she apologized to her plants when she forgot to water them. She had learned that he went still in a particular way when he was actually bothered by something, not the controlled stillness of the king, but a smaller, quieter stillness, a brief pause in whatever he was doing, like a held breath. She had learned to see the difference. They were careful with each other. Exquisitely, almost painfully careful, in the way that people are careful when something matters enough that the thought of damaging it by reaching too fast is its own kind of ache. There was a line between them, unspoken, that they approached and retreated from and approached again, and the approaching was its own language, rich and slow and full of meaning neither of them rushed to translate. Maren was hanging the first of her spring herbs on the drying line inside the cottage when the stranger arrived. She heard the horse before she saw it, not the easy, comfortable sound of a local rider on a familiar path, but the sharp, purposeful percussion of something moving fast and intending to be noticed. She went to the window. The man who dismounted outside her gate was dressed in dark riding clothes with a sigil on the breast that she didn't recognize, a claw mark over a crescent moon, worked in silver thread. He was sharp-faced and neatly assembled, the kind of man who moved as if the world was expected to rearrange itself slightly ahead of wherever he was going. He looked at her cottage the way people look at things they're evaluating, not admiring. Maren went to the door and opened it before he could knock. "I'm looking for someone," he said, without preamble, without a greeting. His eyes moved over her face with an assessing quality that she didn't like. "A woman, lives alone on the Ashwood border. Word is she's been keeping unusual company these past few weeks." Maren leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "There are a lot of women on the Ashwood border," she said pleasantly. "You'll have to be more specific." His gaze moved past her into the cottage interior, a quick professional scan, and then back to her face. Word travels, he said softly, in certain circles, about a wolf that walks between forms, about the border cottage he keeps returning to. A pause, weighted and deliberate. You want to be careful about what you've gotten yourself entangled in. There are people with significant interest in that wolf's whereabouts, people who would consider any shelter extended to him to be a matter of political consequence. The word shelter landed with an intention she didn't miss. I keep goats, Maren said, and herbs. If you're looking for political consequence, you might have the wrong address. Something moved in the man's eyes, not quite amusement, not quite its opposite. He reached into his coat and set a small card on her window ledge, a name and a location written in precise dark ink. If you reconsider your memory, he said, or if your unusual company proves problematic, some of us can be very generous to those who are helpful. He remounted and was gone before she could respond, which she suspected was intentional. Maren stood in the door for a long moment after the sound of hooves had faded. Then she went inside, picked up the card between two fingers, and set it deliberately in the fire. She watched it burn, then she went back to her herbs. She told Kael that evening. He arrived just after dusk, in his wolf form. She'd come to understand that he often shifted for the journey to the cottage, that the wolf in him was drawn to the forest path in a way his human half sometimes was not, and she'd stopped reading any meaning into which form he appeared in beyond a simple preference of the moment. She left the shed door open for him in the warmer weather now. She heard him settle, heard the familiar sound of him arranging himself in the hay, and gave him 20 minutes before she came out with her own cup of tea, and a second that she set on the floor near him, an offering so habitual now that neither of them acknowledged it. She sat on her hay bale and told him about the man with the silver sigil, calmly and precisely, the way the medic had taught her to recount a patient's symptoms, facts first, interpretation after. When she finished, she looked at him. His wolf form was very still. The particular stillness, the small, interior one, the held breath. You know who he works for, she said. It wasn't a question. The gold eyes moved to hers. I'm not frightened, she told him, because she wanted that to be the first thing established between them. I burned the card. I want you to know that I burned it without thinking about it, before I'd even decided to, because it simply wasn't a decision that needed making. But I think you should know they're watching this place. He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. She watched him pace, 3 strides to the shed wall, 3 back, the controlled energy of something powerful working through a problem. And then he stopped and looked at her with an expression in those gold eyes that she'd never seen on him before. Something that was, she thought, very close to helplessness. Not a state he was familiar with, not a state he had a ready shape for. Kael, she said softly. He stilled at his name. Whatever this is, she said, looking at him steadily, whatever's happening in your world that's now standing at my gate asking questions, I'd rather know, all of it. She held his gaze. I'm not made of glass, and I am not afraid of complicated. He came back the next morning as a man. He sat at her table, and he told her everything. The ambush on the ridge, which she had known, in its bones, was the night she'd found him. The traitor within his court, still unidentified, who had arranged it. The faction that wanted him removed from the Northmark throne, led by a rival alpha from the eastern reaches named Doran, a male of political cunning and significant cruelty who had been building his coalition quietly for 2 years. The man with the silver sigil was one of Doran's instruments. The sigil itself was Doran's claw mark, his personal brand. By returning here, Kael said, his voice carrying the flat, measured tone of someone delivering a verdict, I led them to you. He looked at his hands on the table. I knew the risk was possible. I told myself it was manageable. He stopped. Maren waited. I wanted to come back, he said, very quietly. I told myself other things, but that was the truth of it. I wanted to come back, and I wasn't careful enough, and now you're a liability in someone else's war, and that is entirely my fault. The word liability hung in the kitchen air. Maren got up, refilled both their cups, sat back down. She looked at him across the table for a long moment. "Do you know," she said conversationally, "what happened to the last person who came to my door and tried to make me feel like a problem to be managed?" Kael looked up. "I burned his card in my fire." A pause. "I'll do the same with anyone else's." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I'm not a liability, Kael. I'm a person. And I would like to know what we're going to do about the man with the silver sigil, because I have herbs to finish drying and a spring garden that needs turning, and I'd very much like to do those things without someone watching from the tree line." He stared at her. Something happened in his face, something that cracked open slowly, like ice at the end of winter, like something that has been held tight for a very long time finally exhaling. And for the first time since she had known him, in either of his forms, she saw it unguarded and complete. He smiled. Not the careful, controlled expression she sometimes saw him arrange, but the real thing, sudden and unresisted, transforming his face entirely, making him look younger and less encumbered and entirely, devastatingly human. "You are extraordinary," he said. The words landed simply, without decoration, like a fact being named. Maren felt heat move up her throat and decided to be practical about it. "Tell me about Doran," she said. "Start from the beginning." He stayed 3 days. He sent word to his second-in-command, a trusted lieutenant named Soren who had served him for a decade and whose loyalty was beyond question, and settled into the cottage with the focused deliberation of a man rearranging his priorities. He slept in the shed, in his wolf form, which she suspected was partly his nature and partly a choice to put himself between her and the tree line. She didn't argue with it. The 3 days had a quality she would remember for the rest of her life. The specific texture of ordinary moments made luminous by the awareness that they are temporary, that they exist in the parentheses of something larger pressing in from outside. They talked. They worked side by side in the garden, which he took to with a directness that made her laugh. He had no idea what he was doing, but he did it with absolute commitment, following her instructions with the focused attention he probably applied to battle strategy. She taught him which weeds to pull and which to leave. He taught her 3 words in the old shifter tongue that meant, roughly, the smell of a place that knows you. She thought about those words more than she let on. On the second evening, sitting outside the shed door in the last of the day's warmth, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, she asked him something she'd been holding for a while. "When you were in the storm," she said, "when you found the shed, were you frightened?" He was quiet for a moment, honest quiet, not evasive quiet. "Not of dying," he said. "I've made my peace with that possibility, it's part of the work." A pause. "I was frightened of not being found, of disappearing in the storm and no one knowing it had happened, not because of what it would mean for the territory." He paused again, working toward precision. "Just for me, for Kael, not the king." Maren looked at the tree line. "That's the loneliest kind of frightened," she said softly. "Yes," simply, without armor. "It is." The silence between them after that was different from the silences before, warmer, like something had been set down that had been carried a long way. She felt his hand find hers in the dim light. Not urgent, not tentative, settled, like something returning to where it belonged. She turned her palm up and held on. Soren arrived on the 3rd morning, with 4 of Kael's most trusted wolves, and the parentheses closed. Maren stood in her doorway and watched Kael become the king again, watched it happen the way you watch a tide come in, not all at once but steadily, inexorably, the fullness of it returning to fill every space. His posture shifted. His face took on its composed authority. The wolves who'd come with Soren showed it immediately in the way they oriented around him, the subtle gravitational reorganization of bodies in the presence of an alpha. Soren was a tall man with close-cropped hair and watchful eyes that moved to Maren with frank, intelligent assessment, and then back to Kael with something that was almost, not quite, a smile. "My lord," he said, "we've identified the informant." "Inside the house," Kael said. "Steward's office, dealt with." Kael nodded. "Doran." Retreating for now, word of the ambush's failure reached his coalition and 2 of his allied alphas have withdrawn their support. He's damaged but not finished. A pause. "There's a council meeting. They're asking for you." Kael looked at Soren for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then turned. He walked back toward the cottage, back to Maren, and his wolves did not follow. A boundary set without a word, recognized without a word. He stopped in front of her. Up close, she could see both of him clearly, the king in the set of his shoulders and the certainty of his bearing, and underneath it, visible now to her in a way she suspected it had never been visible to anyone else, simply Kael. The wolf who'd leaned against her shed wall in the snow and been too proud and too exhausted and too wounded to go any further, and had let a girl with a lantern lead him toward warmth. "I have to go," he said. "I know. There are things I have to resolve. The council, Doran's network, the territory needs." He stopped himself. "I'm explaining myself," he said, with a trace of something rueful. "I don't usually explain myself." "I know that too." She looked up at him. "Go do what you have to do, Kael." He looked at her with the gold eyes that she now knew she would be able to find in a crowd, in the dark, at any distance. The particular light of them, the particular quality of attention behind them. "I'll come back," he said. Not a reassurance, not a courtesy. A statement of fact delivered with the same certainty he probably used to sign treaties. "I know," she said for the third time, and meant it a different way each time. He lifted one hand and touched her face, just briefly, just his fingertips at her cheek, the warmth of them shocking and familiar all at once. And then he was walking back toward his wolves, and they were moving, and the forest swallowed them, and the cottage clearing was quiet again. He came back in 3 weeks. He came alone, without the wolves, without the riding clothes and the sigil and the careful apparatus of authority. He came in the early evening, from the tree line, in his wolf form, padding across the clearing with that easy, fluid stride, the dark coat catching the last of the spring light, and she opened the shed door without being asked and stood aside to let him in. He stopped in front of her instead. He sat back on his haunches in the way she'd come to recognize as his particular wolfish form of deliberation, and he looked at her with those gold eyes, and then something shifted in the air, a feeling she'd only heard described, had never known how to watch for, and between one breath and the next he was a man. Kneeling in the grass of her doorway, eye level with her for just a moment, looking up at her face. "There are things I should say," he told her, "that I've been working out for 3 weeks. Proper things, fitting things." A pause. "I appear to have left them all in the forest." Maren looked at him. At the Wolf King kneeling in her garden in the spring evening, utterly without pretense, and something in her chest turned over slow and warm and complete. "Ash," she said. His mouth curved. "You're still going to call me that?" "Someone has to keep you humble." She stepped back from the doorway and held it open. "Come inside. I have bread. And I want to hear every proper, fitting thing you left in the forest, and I will help you find the words." He stood. He stepped over her threshold. She closed the door behind them both, and outside the ashwood border hummed with the first warm evening of true spring, and the creek ran clear, and the trees held everything they knew close and quiet and safe, the way old trees do. The way they always have. The way they always will. They say the Northmark grew kinder in the years that followed, that its alpha ruled with a steadiness that hadn't been there before, the same iron authority, but with something underneath it now, some quality of groundedness that his advisors couldn't name and his enemies couldn't crack. That he kept a cottage on the ashwood border with herb gardens that expanded every spring. That the woman who lived there could silence a room full of wolves with a look, though she had never shifted a day in her life, and no one who spent 5 minutes with them together ever doubted for a moment who he came home to. And sometimes, on winter evenings, the locals on the border road would see a great dark wolf moving through the trees toward a lit window, unhurried, certain, following a thread of wood smoke home. They never spoke of it. Some things are sacred,